It's usual that you say, I'm delighted to be here, Kevin, but when I was coming over, I looked at my Kevin anecdotes, and knowing that this is sort of a Kevin Festspiel or Kevin Festival here. And so I looked at the anecdotes, and I went to the conference series in a nice sort of Swiss setting, and Kevin was there repeatedly, and I had two entrepreneurs speak. One was the co-founder of Skype, and the other one had the world's largest Wi-Fi chip production. And I was trying to get them to talk about what they were doing and why this was all different and why this was really changing the way networks work and so forth. And so we were getting through the session. It was going on and on and on, and nobody was really knowing where this was going. And then Kevin got out there and said, "Oh, I get it. It's a phoneless phone company and a chipless chip company." And everybody looked at him and said, "That's precisely it." So this, to me, is Kevin Werbach being able to summarize what's going on and to be able to get to the gist of things with incredible precision. Now, I have about 14 minutes left, and I want to try to think about a new frontier, a new challenge, regulatory challenge that we may be facing. In the previous session, we talked about the last 20 years, and we commiserated about what worked and what didn't work. But let's look at the new challenges, not that we solved any of the old ones. And that has to do, or I would like to look at markets and market competition. Now, when we talk about markets and market competition, immediately this conjures up images of the steel and rubber barons of the 19th century and the attempt by policymakers to rein in this market concentration and this rather egregious behavior that followed from it. But the way we did this, with the exception of merger regulation, but the basic way we did this was that when there was market concentration, we looked at the behavior of those very large incumbent players and looked at whether that behavior was conforming to some set of standards or norms or not. So, in other words, the focus was on behavior. But what we didn't look at was market concentration. That is where the market concentration was coming from. We just said, look, if there is market concentration, then we need to scrutinize behavior. And we took the word of the economists that there was a market when and where there was market concentration. So if you asked economists what was one of the key reasons why market concentration happens, then they would say market concentration happens because we have scale effects. And we all know about scale and scope effects, and that is basically when you get larger, you produce at lower cost. And if you take the quintessential example of scale effects, that is the Ford Model T, then the actual cost of producing the Ford Model T came down by almost 3x over the first couple of years of production, just as the scale was ramping up. Now, when we look at scale effects, what is interesting about those scale effects is that scale effects actually are, in a competitive market, a good thing. That is the lower marginal cost. And so in a competitive market, the argument is that those cost savings are then passed on to consumers, and that is good. Problematic is only when the scale leads to uncompetitive markets, and then the behavior needs to be scrutinized. So that's where we were with scale effects in behavior, scale effects leading to market concentration, then to behavior. Now, over the last maybe 30 years or so, we have been talking about another kind of effect that also can lead to market concentration, and that is the network effects or network effects. And of course, network effects are nothing new. We have had them for a long time. We're just, because of the network nature of some of the digital, or most of the digital economy, we are looking at those network effects in greater detail these days. And the answer to the network effect has also been quite similar, with some exceptions, to the scale effect. That is, network effects in general are good if the market stays competitive. If it doesn't stay competitive, we need to do something, and mostly we look at behavior, but not only we look at behavior. We go sometimes beyond behavior, as Tim has shown. Now, scale effects and network effects have therefore led to market concentrations, and when we have market concentrations, we scrutinize behavior. But let's look a little more closely at this. As I mentioned, both effects are welfare enhancing in competitive markets. But this is like saying it's good to eat, or it's okay to eat 15 bagels a day as long as you stay thin. So markets stay competitive in a concentration dynamic we have taken for granted when there is an ability for new entrants to come in at low cost. So in other words, we are okay with market concentration taking place, as long as behavior is okay, if, and only if, there is a way to unconcentrate markets. And that unconcentration of markets happens through innovation, or at least that's the story. And of course, we know from one of the early gurus of innovation, Joseph Schumpeter, that innovation is all about new products or production processes or new market niches that get then exploited by new entrants and disrupt existing industries and displace incumbent businesses. That's the idea of creative destruction. We have creative destruction in a way to counter market concentration. And when we look at what is innovation all about, then we focus quite a bit on the role of how to incentivize innovation and the role of intellectual property. And we have had robust discussions over the last N years about how much intellectual property protection, particularly patents, we need in order to incentivize innovation significantly enough. And we also take for granted, of course, that innovation comes or stems from human ingenuity. Sometimes we idolize the individual inventor, but basically that's the idea. Now, that's great. And both IP protection and human ingenuity have been cornerstones or core elements of what innovation is. But what, I ask you, happens if the locus of innovation changes? That is, if human ingenuity isn't the source of innovation anymore. And so think about what we are currently experiencing in the tech field, and that is innovation that is feedback data driven and that is based on machine learning. And for those of you who have been in a cave over the last 5 years, this is actually happening everywhere. From the Google self-driving car to autonomously playing poker systems like Libratus, to IBM Watson being able to identify skin cancer better than the average dermatologist, to learning systems that actually try out and use feedback data to customize learning pedagogies to improve learning outcomes of children of all ages. So when we go back to our idea of market concentration being countered by innovation, what happens if innovation is data-driven and based on machine learning rather than human ingenuity? Then, in fact, the very large players who have access to a lot of data and have the capacity to use that data to learn are getting better and better. And then the feedback effect, as I call it, sorry, Herb, different feedback effect, but the feedback effect is then aligning up with the network effects and the scale effects and is not countering the market concentration that scale effects and network effects create. And therefore, we now don't have a countervailing force anymore. So if that is the case, then feedback effects are now driving innovation rather than reducing market concentration, and feedback effects actually actively facilitate and encourage concentration dynamics. Now, so this is only important to the extent that we believe that there is a linkage between innovation and competitive markets. You could disagree with that. And to the extent that we are worried that that linkage is now broken and that innovation turns into a dynamic of deepening market concentration. To the extent that we worry about this, what can we do? What is a potential answer? Well, to me, the obvious answer is to try and spread innovation. And let's go back to the two elements of innovation that is data-driven, so feedback data and machine learning. What could we do in order to spread innovation? The answer to that question has been over the last couple of years to focus on machine learning and to advocate for transparency of algorithms. I am guilty of having done that. I asked for algorithmic transparent algorithms in my big data book, and I tell you today I was wrong. It is a stupid idea if you really think about it. And I confess having not thought it through. Why? Well, because here is the core problem. What do you want to make transparent? If it is the algorithm at any point in time that comes out of the machine learning dynamic, then that algorithm is outdated the very moment somebody else is accessing it because more data is coming in. You rerun the machine learning system and you get a new algorithm. And because these algorithms don't tell us why or only what, we can't look at the algorithm and deduce from it what's behind it. So making that kind of a algorithm transparent doesn't help us very much. Now, the source of innovation isn't the algorithm. The source of the innovation is the data. And so if we want transparency of algorithm doesn't help. In fact, it may make it worse. Because if we are making the meta-algorithms transparent, the first transparency there, that is the machine learning system, rather than the actual instantiation of the algorithm, then we actually take away some of the innovative drive, the innovative competition that is left in the system. So perhaps we should rather focus on the feedback data. That is, focus on making feedback data accessible across the industry. And so I'd like to go out on a limb and suggest a progressive data sharing mandate. That is a mandate that would force every company, every player in the market above a particular threshold to share a particular slice of the data that they have with other competitors. Now, that data sharing mandate is not completely new at all. We have antecedents in a number of areas. It's a little bit, in a way, like FRAND and essential patents on steroids. But it also has been suggested by some of my colleagues, Mr. Plummer and others, in the European context with respect to Google search. I think there is a wider application there, and the idea is to force to share data. But there are some important features that I need to highlight. One is the progressive feature. That is, I would suggest that we force larger companies with bigger market share to have to share a bigger slice of their data than smaller companies. So let's suppose above 10%, if you're above 10% market share, you have to share data. But the bigger you get, the more of your data you have to share. Now, you have to share it with everyone and anyone in the industry that wants it. It's a real progressive system, and it requires comprehensiveness and randomness. That is, it really needs to go to everybody, and it really needs to be random. That is, everybody who is requesting a slice of your data gets a different slice. Randomly selected. Now, that's a very important element of it because you want to create diversity. You want to create heterogeneity of data sources for a number of reasons that I can't go into here. Many challenges would remain. For example, how often would you have to accept repeated requests? How can you share beyond the initial share, and how do you constrain that some party isn't giving the data away? How do you deal with metadata and ontologies? Oops, there's a typo here, sorry. And the technical modalities of access so that you can actually use the different sources of data. Of course, the big issue of information privacy, unresolved, and then the issue of the relative data size to be shared. How quickly is that going up or down? Lots of stuff to still tussle over or to debate. I am less concerned about whether you see the merits of my proposed solution here, although I believe that some of the key features that I mentioned, access, progressiveness, and randomness, are really important. But I'm more concerned and more interested that hopefully some of you see the problem. That is, the problem we face, the insufficiency of the existing solutions, and the potential need for something more than what we already have. Thanks.
Great.
Good job. Thank you.
That was a really good presentation. That was great. that was fantastic. Oh, was that me? All right. So is this the thing that moves it? Let's see. Nope. This one. OK. So hey, everybody. I'm going to talk about innovation gaps and how to find them. But before I do that, I'm going to engage in some late 90s nostalgia because we're invited to by Kevin, I think, by this whole conference. And I was going to reflect on where I was in the late 1990s. In fact, I was a law student, 97, and I made this decision, which changed my life, actually, which is there was this strange class called the Law of Cyberspace being taught by a visiting professor at this place, Berkman Center. This was the guy, Lawrence Lessig, and he taught this just great, weird class. We had an online multi-user dungeon in the class where we had to interact in virtual, well, it wasn't virtual reality, just text. And yeah, that's where it was. It's kind of it's a little too bad Larry's not here. Well, he sort of left for a different field. He decided he had to get to the root of the problem, as he puts it. It's kind of interesting to see what we were interested in back there. The one thing I will note, I was looking back at, this is from Wayback Machine, is the one thing we're not talking about is DNS and ICANN. And it's interesting to think just how much time that kind of consumed in mental space for people for many, many years. And it's one thing that's not being discussed at all. So I want to situate this between two works, two sort of classics. Here's Kevin Werbach's famous paper already discussed. I took a careful look. I like this note. I don't know if you noticed it. The graphics associated with this document are not included in this WordPerfect version. You can get them. But I want to, so when you reread that paper, and I even got out the core of it, the tornado itself, the internet spiral, some of the things it has. You know, it has this note of optimism, of stay out of the way, everything's going to be great. And you know, this, speaking of the era, a sense, we'll say, a faith that innovation is going to happen, and we just got to stay out of the way of the digital tornado. Fast forward a few years back, here's a work that came out a few years ago. I don't know if people are familiar or read this book, Great Stagnation. The author makes a very different claim. You know, now we're talking so many years. Innovation is stagnated, the economy is stagnated. His basic thesis is that the low-hanging fruit has all been eaten, and you can expect the economy to be stagnant for, you know, maybe generations to come. This was a best-selling book in 2011. And I think it reflects at least a feeling, you know, the statistics are contested, that you know, innovation is a fickle process. You know, industries seem to become more innovative in certain periods and seem to become at less. The fault I'd have with this book is it's trying to talk about all of the economy or maybe the entire world at once, as if you're innovative or you're not. I think what we need to do is think, you know, and I'm not alone in this, letting other people do, is think about industries. And the way I've thought about this, trying to think about it for years, is to think about predictable cycles of innovation that you see inhabit particular industries, that they go through life cycles. This cycle I described was better described. This is Christopher Yu describing my work. He didn't agree with it. He thinks I'm wrong, but he did describe it very well right here, and his co-authors. And he's basically describing this situation here. So I'm going to go back to the last slide. That in industries, you tend to have a cycle that repeats. Now, we're mainly talking about Schumpeterian innovation, although I'll talk about some other things, where you have, you know, every 20, 30 years, a sort of deck-clearing innovation. We're not talking about a better mousetrap, but we're talking about something that is really challenging to a lot of industries, something, you know, like the personal computer, something like the radio. And that tends to lead to an open age where barriers to entry very low, a lot of experimentation. No one knows what business models work. And ideally, some utopic ideas what will happen. That itself tends to yield to an era where you have the establishment of a few, maybe one, but maybe a few more powerful companies. At least in their early manifestations, they're usually quite attractive. They come to power, usually for good reasons. Sometimes, historically, these are called golden ages. You know, golden age of radio, golden age of television, and so forth. And often they're engaged in a lot of internal innovation at those stages. And then there reaches some crucial turning point where, and I guess I would put it this way, where investments in innovation become less attractive than investments in barriers to entry as a way of returning, as a means to return. The company, one way or another, realizes it can maybe do better just by keeping out competitors. It often becomes interested in preventing this from happening to itself, that its own displacement becomes something it tries to avoid. And the control asserted transform technology to freely accessible, something controlled by a corporation cartel, till some new form of ingenuity starts to cycle anew. Now, pretty key to this idea are a couple things. I'm not choosing one form of innovation and valuing it. I'm trying to value several. Schumpeter is a complicated figure. I actually think he has, there's two versions of him, two of him, frankly. There's one Schumpeter who believed that everything started with these small entrepreneurs, and that they changed the world. They were like these unusual characters, almost like superheroes, one in a million, that had some vision and were able to take things further. There was a Schumpeter in the 1950s who fell in love with a giant corporation for a while and sort of suggested only giant laboratories could really do anything worthwhile. And Kenneth Arrow's sensibility that competitive markets, that monopolists lack incentives to innovate, and competitive markets do a better job. So I'm valuing each of these in this model. I should say I'm certainly not the only person to have thought about innovation cycles. Stigler did one at some point about vertical integration, whatever. But I think it is really key to everything we're talking about, especially over this 20-year period, to ask whether these things really are cyclical. And if they're so, what do we do essentially to keep the cycle turning? I think at one point we hoped we could kind of just keep everything stuck here in the, and that was sort of the faith, I think, of maybe the FCC in the 90s. Stuck here in the, I'm trying to point to, I won't reach, to the open sort of experimental age, the internet protocols would do it, or people being really, people are different in California, or, everything's free, or something like that would happen. But, as everyone knows, we moved into an age where the network became dominated. So I think the question has more become, well, how do you keep the cycle turning? So I've been trying to think about this, and particularly thinking about it from an antitrust context. And one of the things I think we really need to get at is the question of measuring, measuring, predicting, and presuming not only the effect of dynamic rewards. That is, for example, the idea that if you offer someone a patent 20 years, or you offer them a prize, that will put innovation out there. But getting a better idea of what retards innovative activity, what gets in the way. One of the things that I mentioned the Kronos effect, I guess that's a little bit off, but one of the challenges I said is the stagnant monopolist, the stagnant cartel, is investing in efforts often to prevent itself being displaced by innovation. And so can we measure that sort of thing? Can we measure the retarding of innovative activity, and can we prove that it's happening? So how do you do this? I'm not suggesting it's easy. This is what I'm trying to write the paper about. I'm surveying some of the current approaches. Do you have something to say there? So let's take an example of random company. I don't know, why not we choose Facebook? And so there's been a lot of headlines in the news about Facebook. Here's an article in the Wall Street Journal, squashes competition from startups. There's people, venture capitalists, you hear from different things. Oh, we're not going to invest in anything that Facebook could copy or be in. So the question is, that said a lot? Can you prove it? Can you measure it? Is there any way of moving it beyond just people talking and into some kind of thing, particularly actionable, in antitrust, saying there's something that people can act on? And how would you find that? That's what I'm really interested in trying to figure out. So one way of doing it, I'm going to talk about how it's sort of been done traditionally. Some of the ways of doing it traditionally are just looking for conduct that looks exclusionary, and then presuming from that conduct and some of the effects felt by it, that there must be some effects on innovation going on. One example, not everyone here is an antitrust person. There's a somewhat famous case called Allied Tube, where the manufacturers of steel pipes, steel conduit, got together, and they controlled the standards board, and they made the standards board have a big vote to make basic plastic tubing, which was new and an innovation supplied by foreign providers, better, cheaper, not to be part of the fire code, so that therefore they keep them out. So that's sort of straightforward, and it seems like, well, that would probably dampen innovation in the space. There's been an effort, I won't spend a lot of time on it, in merger analysis and antitrust to develop this idea of an innovation market. I'm not sure this has been a completely successful effort, but it's certainly one of the things people have tried to do. Maybe something people could also start getting better at is trying to figure out natural experiments in comparable industries. Could we figure out somehow how much investment in innovation is going? Let's take Facebook as our example. If you look at you go over a certain time period, maybe the last 5 years, and you look at the markets which are roughly in the Facebook shadow and those which are not, do you see measurable differences in investment? I think that would be interesting if you could figure it out. You know, try to get some sense, measurement of the shadow that is cast. Another approach, and I'm going to sort of end here, is to create rebuttable presumptions. Just say that maybe we believe, rebuttably, after some time, if a monopoly has been around long enough, and you can rebut this, that we should presume it's been retarding or slowing down innovation in its field. This is based on, I'm deriving this view from Oliver Williamson's ideas in the 70s, where he said, when you have persistent dominance, we have companies been along too much, we need to just presume there's been market failure. We need to presume something's wrong. Why is that company, I mean, it's possible that they have been efficient and innovative the entire time, but maybe that doesn't seem likely, and so therefore do something about it. This led to the idea of breakups without conduct. And I'll add to this, what this leads to this idea that maybe we should think about monopoly more generally in all industries, somewhat the way we think about it in patent. You can admit that, you know, as Schumpeter suggested, and as like Scalia said in the Trinkel idea, that the lure of monopoly does encourage a certain level of innovative effect. People would like to be Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg or have billions of dollars. It's appealing to some people. Certainly sounds nice. But then at some point that wears off, that incentive does its work. I mean, no one says, oh yeah, patent incentivizes people, therefore it should last 1,000 years. You know, maybe 20 years. There's got to be some point where that incentive, and once you've gotten over $1 billion, you know, you're pretty much, and once you've been a monopolist for 10 years, maybe that's all the incentive you really need. And so I think maybe in antitrust particular, we need a more dynamic approach to how we think about, this is an idea that no one seems to like, but I'll put it out there, that you know, the timing investigation in anti-monopoly actions, Section 2 actions, needs to be done with a thought about the prize being offered, whether the incentive was adequate. If that is so, whether it's overdoing it, and we should start to presume that this thing is stagnant if it's been around too long, or ask for rebuttal of the idea that's been stagnant, and if not, move into what we all like, which are giant breakups. All right, thank you very much.
Well, thank you to both Victor and Tim. Those are excellent presentations, complementary ways of dealing with antitrust and innovation, both worth thinking about. I just want to make a couple of suggestions, and then let's have a discussion, okay? Number one, I think one way to solve, or to address, not to solve, but to address both the problem that Victor cites and the problem that Tim cites is a different approach to merger enforcement that is less focused on current market shares, because frankly the problem is market shares are much more elastic in digital markets, where sales can triple and quintuple in a matter of months if the demand is there, and as a result market shares are not a good indicator of merger impact in digital markets the way they are, say, in automobile production or something like that. And the other factor that can also be addressed through merger policy is market product differentiation. You know, one of the reasons we have as much competition as we do in digital markets, which have very extreme economies of scope, is product differentiation, right? Why is not everybody on Match.com? Well, everybody who's single. Why is not everybody who's single on Match.com? Because the most efficient website would have all the boys and all the girls so they could find each other, and the answer is different dating sites offer different sets of features and appeal to different groups, and it's been easier to attain product differentiation in dating sites than it has, for example, in search engines, although some companies have tried to do it, and that's why search engines have moved toward a dominant position much more readily than something like data sites. With respect to Victor's sharing obligation, my very first instinct was to say, well, how are we going to enforce this anyway? And then I thought of the 1996 Telecom Act with its with its interconnection obligations. If you think those work well, now I will tell you what I think. I think they did work reasonably well given the cumbersome two-level system we created for enforcing interconnection obligations. But if you think we can do it with interconnection into the hardwired network, we can probably do it with data as well. However, I don't think we could do it through the antitrust laws. The antitrust laws, courts of general jurisdiction, this would have to be enforced by jury trials. That sounds like a nightmare to me. I think this would be a job for a federal agency that has some expertise. On Tim's paper on innovation, I'm instinctively inclined to agree with him. I think merger policy here would help as well. I think there's one other big thing that would help, and that is we have to change policy, Fed Circuit policy, with respect to externally acquired unused patents. I can tell you what's happening now, and it's happening because the Federal Circuit has approved it in a big case called Trebro versus Firefly about 5 or 6 years ago, in which a dominant firm acquired a patent that was invented by a third-party inventor, that is, purchased it by transfer, and didn't use it because it held complementary technology that it was using. So it has this unused patent, and then it brought a patent infringement suit and got an injunction against a new entrant who committed infringement of that patent. Well, that's perverse. That's using the patent system to shut down competing technologies rather than to facilitate their entry. And so I think we need to make clear through the patent system that the patent system should not be a mechanism for shutting down unused technology, but rather for facilitating the new entry of technology. Anyway, 2 excellent papers. You don't want to hear me, so I want to hear you. So any questions? Yes?
I need to get the microphone around to it. Sure, I'm pretty loud, so I'll just begin. Yeah, just for the people listening in on the stream, sorry. Oh, I see.
Ooh, they have, I just noticed the paper has the logo of the digital tornado in it. It's pretty cool.
So my question is about is really about an observation about these companies and antitrust and you mentioned two-way markets and I'm particularly interested in considering the way in which some of these two-way markets act the way that exchanges do or have done in the past. And in particular, if we look at an example of the New York Stock Exchange, we see that it enjoyed a large monopoly as being the liquidity, the equity market with the greatest liquidity for many U.S. equities for a long time. And the only way to address this was when the SEC came in and introduced Reg NMS, which made them compete with other exchanges because every exchange who wanted to be part of the national market system needed to both listen to a consolidated feed of all of the best bids and offers and also publish their own. And if an order came in that would be marketable at the current price, it would have to route it to the other exchange. So this standardized, in some sense, these markets. And I'd like to draw the connection to what Professor Mayer-Schönberger said about regulating the input stage of these firms, which are the data. Why not look at the output stage? Here's an example of from the securities industry in which the output stage was regulated directly by a regulator, and it worked very well. We had immediately within a year we had competition from BATS and Instinet and a whole bunch of other competing exchanges. The monopoly was crushed, and the spreads had changed. That market was fundamentally changed, and yet in the context of these two-way markets in the internet services like the Amazons and et cetera, we have not seen this. So how are we going to move forward in this vein?
Victor?
I have no answer to that question, although I'm delighted that you asked that question. We know each other, and We've had a number of conversations where I've always learned, so I'm learning again. There's a larger point that I didn't make. And the larger point that I didn't make was that there was another reason why I wanted to suggest the progressive data sharing mandate. I alluded to it when I said heterogeneity is really important or diversity is really important. One of the fundamental challenges I see with market concentration is also that we have single points of failure that are developing in terms of companies or mechanisms or market platforms, whatever you want, or decision support systems, because they're all using the same output, even if the output is regulated. And so I wanted to come up with a mechanism by which we can create diversity of input and therefore diversity of output. And that was a way to do that.
I actually have a question for our moderator. Is that all right? Can I ask a question? Oh, okay. I want to ask a question about something you said to him, which is, I can understand your instinct that what he's talking about seems regulatory. Does it seem, couldn't it possibly be an antitrust remedy? You imagine a Section 2 case with a company. You imagine, and what he's sort of saying in some antitrust terms, this is a big barrier to entry. One of the ways of framing it, this is a big barrier of entry because they can innovate and other people can't. So we import the Viktor scheme, and that's the remedy that supposedly fosters competition in this area.
So you'd be asking a federal district judge to decide which data needs to be shared, what the threshold is, timing. I don't see it.
Is Judge Green still around, maybe?
Judge Green is dead. It was interconnection that killed him. Let's go on to another question, but let me just add one very quick aside, and that is, just 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court granted cert in its first, what promises to be its first decision explicitly addressing the impact of the Sherman Act in a two-sided market. It's Ohio versus American Express from the Second Circuit. And all eyes interested in two-sided markets ought to be on that case. Someone else? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Tom Keenan from the University of Calgary. We had a fascinating revelation a month ago that some reporter was able to find names that were under publication bans. So these are young offenders, victims and perpetrators, and the newspaper immediately thought, oh my God, it's in our metadata or something. Well, it's not. It was much more subtle than that. And you gave us just enough tantalizing information about your feedback idea. I'd like to know if it would help with this. The way it worked was that so many people had searched on Google, and this only happened on Google, that there was an association somewhere in their data. And so then if you put in the person you thought was the young offender, it brought you to the newspaper link. And Google said, oh my God, we didn't do that, right? But we'll take down individual cases. Would your idea address things like that, where in fact it's the AI somewhere in the data has linked that together, but nobody even knows about it? Google said, we don't know about it.
Possibly. One of the advantages of a progressive data sharing mandate is that those that avail themselves of that opportunity get data from different sources and from different collection mechanisms, if you want. And therefore you have some kind of diversity in data and hopefully some diversity in bias in the data as well. So there is a hope or a promise, but I'm not sure to what extent it will be realized, that such heterogeneous data has less obvious bias in there than homogeneous data from one particular source. Let's put it that way.
Go ahead.
So this is for Viktor also. How are you going to regulate data requests themselves? I mean, so it's not, as I see it, for your thing, I get the idea, for the feedback effect to serve this market checking function, you actually want new entrants.
Yes.
But new entrants are not existing competitors. And so if you're going to provide a data sharing mandate, it's not for existing competitors, it's actually for new entrants. But then again, what stops me, as a new entrant into whatever market I happen to want to get the data on, from making frequent requests every day to lots of different industries that have data, and just sort of, here, give me my slice, 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 da, da, da. And in fact, I can automate that process as a new entrant into lots of different markets, and all of a sudden you've got a tragedy of the commons operating on your, built on top of your data sharing mandate, which kind of, ends up ruining the thing in the first place. So have you thought that through? And
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how you have, because it sounds like a really good.
No, I think that's a real good point, and that's why I said one of the challenges that remains is sort of the periodicity or the longitude of requests. How often can you make a request? Can you make a request every month, or can you make a request every quarter, or can you make a request every day? Anybody entering an industry. I don't think that there can be a differentiation between you deserve having access to data and you deserve not, other than can you provide the technical competence and the minimal technical competence of actually accessing the data through a particular API. But I do think that there would be some kind of a process whereby this dynamic that you described would not happen, where you sort of go around and do that every 10 seconds or every minute. And you would also need some constraints about how to repurpose that data, right? Because otherwise you just create an incentive for new, basically data intermediaries to come into being.
Hey, Elliot Maxwell, a couple of questions. One is a more comment, Victor, and that is, take an example like digital learning. So we have, if we take sort of two, edX on one side and Coursera on another, there's a problem with the kind of the potential privatization of data out of these things. And the one way of thinking about this is we have an opportunity to have this data made available to the learning science community, which would be a pro-social result. edX has been interested in that, Coursera less so.
Right.
And the issue of taking slices of data doesn't help, because in fact you would like the learning community to have as much data as possible, and there's not different slices of this. So, I think in general, the notion of having an obligation to make data available is necessary and pro-social, maybe not in the way that you're describing it.
Yeah.
So that's one thing.
Okay.
The second, maybe to Tim, and that is lots of very interesting work has been done in the economics literature about the virtues of sharing information and how that interacts with the patent system and other and more closed ways of thinking about this. The virtue, for instance, in the Human Genome Project versus its competitor. So how should we be thinking about this innovation, these innovation gaps, in the context of reducing the power of patents, or the length of patents, or the terms and conditions of patents, to get the virtues of sharing more readily available throughout the digital economy? So two different comments, two different questions.
Very quick. I think that the fact that this is a slice or a sample of the data, whether it's a couple of percentage points or whatever it ends up being, is less of a problem statistically speaking. Although I grant you that comprehensive is better than the slice, but inferences could still be made, and if you get different slices and combine them, it's quite helpful and quite powerful in itself. I'm less worried about that. I am worried about whether this is just if this is just confined to the market space, or if this goes beyond for a greater social good. And in fact, in the book that Kevin mentioned that I've written and that is coming out in February, we suggest that for ensuring competitive markets, we want to have the progressive data sharing mandate. But in a later chapter, we actually suggest that we should take the progressive data sharing mandate and consider creating a progressive data tax out of that. and that data tax would not just go to market entrants or to anybody else in the market, but would actually be available to civil society organizations or research organizations to learn from that.
Let me make a comment about some of these. Christopher, I missed my shout out to you. Sorry. Let me make a comment about both these, both commentators' comment about patent. I want to say it, I'm trying to convert everyone in this room to try to, I think people in this room already do kind of think dynamically, but think even more dynamically, and think about patent policies being very challenging to think about what you think of patent unless you're thinking about who's owning it and what stage of an innovation cycle they are. Because, a patent in the hands of a very early stage investor, a very, very early stage entrepreneur inventor, let's say like Alexander Graham Bell or something, is this, serves kind of the purpose it was supposed to. It's the seed, it gives them some room, they have an opportunity to fight off some monster who's going to try to destroy them. But then it's a very different thing when we're thinking about some giant patent thicket. 40 years later, someone's trying to get started and they get crushed, or leaving aside patent trolls, and that's a different sort of situation. But just, it becomes this massive. And I think the real challenge for this entire group, people here are policy and legal people, are trying to deal with these sort of legal instruments and tools that we create ostensibly to foster innovation and make things better for everybody on the planet Earth, and understanding how these tools work differently in different hands, and seeing if we can design tools that do consistently work different in different hands in the way they want to. And I don't think we've got anywhere near to that problem. I think half the time we design things that look, fantastic when our presumption. I mean, a little like digital, going back to the digital tornado. There's a lot of things that was said in that made a lot of sense when you were talking about 5,000 ISPs. And that's sort of, when you read through that document, you're like, this is completely right, assuming 5,000 ISPs. You read that document with 4 ISPs, and you're like, are you kidding me? We got to stay away from these guys because, it's just going to cripple them or hurt them or something like that. It just seems like, well, wait a second, these guys. So that power dynamic is sort of, we have these normal general applicability laws, but then we don't have this power dynamic. It's a big problem. Antitrust might be a little bit better at it. Telecom, it's very challenging for telecom.
And to me, the fascinating part about this panel is that we've expanded so far beyond telecoms companies or internet companies, and the problems that Victor was describing, it strikes me as as much targeted at financial and insurance companies as they are at internet companies, and fintech and other areas are where we get some skin back in the game with things like blockchain, where suddenly the internet lawyers are being listened to again. In the wider discussion, I think they always listen to Tim because of the pies that he put his fingers into in that regulatory sense. But the response to it, which strikes me as most attractive, is the way in which we approach mergers. And again, this seems like 20 years ago, when merger was the area in which we had the most dynamic view of looking at how the internet economy was being shaped. A couple of us were talking about the fact that AOL Time Warner looked like the end of the world in 1999-2000 when we were looking at what would happen with innovation in that area. But when it comes to merger review and how we try to dynamically analyze mergers, it strikes me that there's a couple of examples. One's good and one's shocking. The shocking one is, of course, Facebook, WhatsApp, where there was seemingly a complete dropping of the ball on the analysis of what was happening there, given that, hey, this thing's free, what damage could it possibly do to innovation in downstream markets? But the one that I think has often been overlooked, and Herb might have a view on whether this has been overlooked in the States, is that after, I've been fingered as working for the villainous company, after WorldCom died, an appeal they were still involved in carried on rumbling on, which is the WorldCom Sprint case. And this was a case about whether WorldCom was tying up the tier 1 backbone market for the internet, because all of these were confidential arrangements between only 2 parties. WorldCom had so many webs of these contracts that they ended up having far greater knowledge of the market than any regulator could do or any other company could do. And because of their much greater knowledge of the data that was required, they could therefore manipulate the market, which funnily enough ended up, the appeal succeeded, and actually WorldCom won by suggesting that neat bit of game theory actually wasn't going to be taken into account in the decision. But it strikes me that something like that is a real precedent for saying, hey, we do see these data buckets and the data bucket being allowed to be used in this extraordinarily anti-competitive way. And so I can see a way that you can leverage this into mergers. The reason in particular why mergers appeals to me as the solution to this is that any individual
I'd call it off data in a kind of Russian trolling exercise I did a couple of years ago. But an off data would have to be so powerful to regulate insurance and financial companies and others to actually do this. It strikes me that the only woman in the world who could do this is called Vestager, and she's the competition commissioner in Brussels, and that no one else could possibly override the interests of the individual industry, ministries and others to actually get this achieved. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts
Well,
on this.
we're never limited by what's possible. I mean, that's not the point of academia. That's not the point of academia. Can I speak about mergers? If I love talking about merger policy. So, I've become converted. I'm more antitrust than ever. Actually, just a couple, since we're on this nostalgia retrospective. It's interesting to think that if the government had blocked AOL Time Warner, they would have been doing a big favor to the company. It would have been, oh, thanks a lot, guys. Instead, if anyone remember this, they set up a careful sharing regime for instant messenger, which was presumed, I know, which, I understand at the time, it seemed like the big deal. You never know, so it's not fun. Speaking fun of making fun of things, when we're looking back at 20 years and the sort of mistakes that were made, I kind of agree with you that there were a number of mergers. I more than agree with you in this space. And this is Herb's comment that maybe the market share wasn't really what should have been looked at, particularly around some of the giants. Facebook buying Instagram, Facebook buying WhatsApp, and say Google buying Waze as three examples. Now, you're talking about product differentiation and why they're different dating. There maybe could be more than a couple competing social media companies, but they were acquired. I think give Facebook credit for seeing it. I went back and read the Office of the British Office of Fair Trading analysis of why they approved the Instagram Facebook merger. So the good thing for the American agencies, they don't publish their rationale, but unfortunately British office did publish it, and so they said, well, Facebook doesn't have a camera app right now, so they're not in any of Instagram's markets. And they said, Instagram hasn't got its advertising business going yet, so they're not in any Facebook markets. So these companies are not competitors. Therefore, there's no competition concerns, therefore the merger goes ahead. Now, admittedly, Instagram was a small company back then. I'm not sure if they were so small, maybe, but something was wrong with that analysis. I have another paper about attention markets, and I think one of the things that was wrong is they were clearly competing for attention as a resource at the time. Even already they were in direct competition, and that should have been something you were looking at. But I echo your and Herb's suggestion that there was something wrong in the state of merger review, and it might be a really useful tool for some of these areas, but a lot of mergers have happened that shouldn't have. Have been allowed that should not have been allowed.
The Facebook merger is just totally backwards reasoning, in my view. I mean, the real thrust of these types of merger queries, where market share is very elastic because it's digital content, is to protect product differentiation, because that's the only way you get structural competition when you've got such enormous fixed costs. Firms will grow to monopoly levels as long as everybody else is trying to duplicate exactly what they're doing. But product differentiation will permit multiple firms to survive even when you do have large economies of scale. So I think we're looking at these kinds of mergers in the wrong way.
Let me, can I
Oh, yes,
quickly
go
ask to add this? There is a case when Google bought ITA, the back office travel company, as a part of the consent decree. Google had to share or to open the data that they had to anybody on FRAND standards. But not only that, they also had to make available a smaller version, if you want, of the data to anybody for free. So there was actually a data sharing mandate built into it. That data sharing mandate had a 5-year duration and is going to expire next year. And there's some controversy because Google announced that they're closing down the free feed. But I think that points towards merger reviews being able to do data sharing.
Was it effective, do you think? Or do you know? I mean, you haven't studied it.
Ask the people at Hopper, but I think they would agree. What was interesting is that when Google bought this ITA back office, the fear was that Bing and one of the and then Priceline and Kayak would be cut out of that. But that did not happen, but those were willing to pay. What actually happened also was that smaller startups, and Hopper is one of them, could come onto the scene and offer a new product, a more innovative product. So in that sense, I'd say, yeah, it worked.
Yes.
So one question is for Viktor, and that's on data. I really agree with you that the power is in the data and that we need to shift our attention there. But my question is, how do you account for the fact that once you mandate data, there is less incentives to produce it, and so. This assumes that there is a market out there. The data is simply there, whereas the whole market is actually investing in producing it. And at least one concern is that companies would be reluctant to do that and would simply find ways to come up with the algorithms themselves.
I'm going to identify you as a visiting.
And I have a question for you too.
Oh, okay, you do. Good.
And I think that links to our previous conversation about innovation. And I think here it's interesting to note in the previous panel we were discussing the difficulty of regulation to address this innovative market because it's so innovative that and speedy that we cannot address it. And your concern is about stagnation. And here. The question is, to what extent you also consider some of the other forces that are non-market forces. And in digital innovation, we've seen over the past 20 years that there were non-market actors, such as open source, and that was actually challenging and forcing for competition and innovation among the market players. And on the other hand, some innovation that comes from the state. So we look at an environment where there's a lot of effort made by states now in investment in cybersecurity, and that migrates into the market and maybe takes care of some of the innovation that then occurs.
Okay, fair enough. Do you want to go first?
I have a very short. My sense is that because the data sharing mandate would only mandate a slice to be given off, the company that is collecting the full swath of the data would still get the most out of the data. And so there would still be a strong incentive, an economic incentive to collect, but that there would also be an incentive to improve the machine learning dynamic, which actually is a good thing.
Can I say something about that Jack Ma comment, which I guess was started with? You know, I don't know what I'm going to try to be polite. So the statement is like, of course, the statement is, things are moving too fast, government can't regulate them. It's very possible government will do a bad job regulating them. That I'll grant. But so long, now I'm going to speak as an enforcement person, as long as we have a monopoly on force, the question of can or can't, doesn't seem China's a lot of trouble regulating speech, for example. They throw the guys in jail. It's like we can't. So the moving too fast thing, I don't really. I understand it as okay. Technology moves fast. You'll do a very bad job. The idea you can't have any effect on this is what would be the right word? Mysticism.
Hopeful thinking.
Hopeful, and it's kind of 90s. I mean, it's kind of a 90s. I almost thought like it was a speech from the 90s about how you can't move this stuff. But on your direct question, I think, so my model is actually, as you point out, and I think it's a good point. This is Neva, by the way, we're not doing self-identification, usually at Haifa, right now visiting at our own Columbia Law School. It's a good point. My model is in tension with that, and sort of in tension with Yochai Benkler's work, in the sense that my model of innovation, even in tension with what you're saying, is I'm taking a simplistic model of innovation which has an entrepreneur, coming up with a new idea and then challenging the existing companies. What about when it comes from different directions? Does that affect the cycle in other directions? So I take that comment as a good one. It depends on how powerful we think these other paths of innovation are. I think they are powerful, and it depends, then we get the same question as to whether, what I've talked about is a stagnant company who's more interested in self-preservation, kind of like a congressperson who's been in office for, X number of terms, is no longer interested in new ideas, just interested in staying in office. Do they have the same interest in trying to stamp those out or limit their effect, and what does that look like? And I think those are important questions.
One more.
No, go for it, man.
Make it quick, we'll be good.
Yeah.
Listen.
I was concerned, Victor, about the issue of, I mean, throats and briefs with privacy. I mean, the whole notion of giving off data from Facebook, Google, whether it's PII or even anonymized but still linked to various bits. How do you deal with that kind of an issue in this kind of situation? Not only that, but if a privacy policy says only certain conditions will we share your data, now you're adding Russian roulette into it.
Yeah, strangely enough, and I think Chris alluded to that, my main focus in a way wasn't Facebook necessarily, or wasn't Google as markets. I am even more concerned about what we will see in the insurance markets, what we will see in the financial services markets, what we will see in the medical services markets, and so forth. So therefore, the question there is, can we actually share data that is stripped of some or most personal information? When we look at autonomous driving data, for example, that may or may not be possible. We have things like differential privacy. We have things like homologic encryption. There's some things that help, but there is no silver bullet. And I am not suggesting that we should make personal information available to third parties without any of those constraints or safeguards in place.
How about a hand for our panel?
All right, we're going to go right into the next grouping, so bring them up here and give us a minute to switch.
Thank you very much. That went very well.
Thanks, that was great.